a lot of situations where people are just really cheating off some players, and it's hard to play. We're trying to find ways to win basketball games. I mean, we've had to play small a little bit more. It's not just Asia's points, it's her gravity. It's her pull. It's how she gets, her presence gets other people open.
Two of the WNBA's biggest stars watched Sunday's game from the sideline, and the absence shaped nearly everything that happened on the court in Las Vegas. The Indiana Fever traveled to T-Mobile Arena to face the Las Vegas Aces without Caitlin Clark, who has been out for a third straight game while recovering from a back injury she aggravated during a late June contest against the Phoenix Mercury. The Aces were missing their own centerpiece, four-time MVP A'ja Wilson, who has been sidelined for 3 consecutive games with a right ankle injury suffered when she rolled it in the fourth quarter of a win over the Chicago Sky. Both players had been named starters for the WNBA All-Star Game on July 25 in Chicago just days earlier, a selection that only sharpened the contrast between who was supposed to be on the floor and who actually was. Aces head coach Becky Hammond had addressed Wilson's status before tip-off, saying that had this been a playoff game, her star forward most likely would have played. Instead, with the regular season still in front of them, Las Vegas chose caution over urgency. That decision set the terms for the afternoon. Without Wilson patrolling the paint, the Aces were without the physical presence that has anchored their defense and their rebounding all season. Wilson entered the game leading her team with 9.4 rebounds and 1.9 offensive rebounds per game, and her absence was not something a single lineup adjustment could paper over. The first quarter gave little indication of what was coming. Las Vegas led 24-23 after the opening period, a tight competitive stretch that looked like it could have gone either way. Indiana answered by the half, taking a 42-41 lead on a jumper from Lexi Hull that beat the buzzer. At that point, the game was still a coin flip on paper, decided by a single possession, with neither team pulling away. That changed in the second half. Indiana's Kelsey Mitchell took over as the focal point of the Fever offense, finishing with 27 points on 7 of 18 shooting from the field and a near-perfect 10 of 12 from the free throw line. The volume of free throws mattered as much as the volume of shots. Mitchell spent much of the game putting pressure on the Aces' defense and getting to the line, a sign of how often Las Vegas was forced into fouls trying to contain dribble penetration without their usual rim protection. Aaliyah Boston complemented Mitchell's scoring with 18 points and 10 rebounds, her 6th double-double of the season, giving Indiana a dependable interior presence of its own even with Clark out of the lineup. Hull added 10 points, including the buzzer-beating shot that swung momentum at halftime. For Las Vegas, Jackie Young led all scorers on the losing side with 15 points, but that total represented the Aces' lowest scoring output from any player in a game all season. Jewel Lloyd added 12 points, and Chelsea Gray contributed 10 points and 6 assists. It was a competent professional performance from all three, but none of it was enough to offset what was happening in the areas of the game that don't show up as prominently in a box score scoring column. The numbers behind the numbers tell the real story of how this game got out of hand. Las Vegas shot just 40% from the field, their second lowest mark of the season. Indiana attempted 70 shots over the course of the game. Las Vegas attempted only 55. That 15-shot gap did not come from Indiana simply choosing to shoot more. It came from rebounding, and specifically from second-chance opportunities. The Aces finished with just 6 offensive rebounds to Indiana's 13, and were out-rebounded on the defensive glass as well, 26-24. The result was 4 second-chance points for Las Vegas all game, a season low for the franchise. Every missed shot that Indiana grabbed and turned into another possession was, in effect, another shot Las Vegas never got to take. This is precisely the kind of statistical erosion that happens when a team loses its primary rebounder. Wilson's value to the Aces has never been limited to her scoring average. Her ability to control the defensive glass and generate extra possessions on offense has been a load-bearing part of how Las Vegas wins games. Without her, the margins that usually favor the Aces flipped, and they flipped in an area that compounds over 40 minutes rather than in a single dramatic sequence. A team can survive one bad quarter of shooting. It is much harder to survive giving up 7 extra shot attempts to your opponent over the course of the entire game. Speaking after the loss, Hammond pointed to the rebounding numbers directly, acknowledging that the disparity on the glass was central to the outcome. It was not framed as an excuse tied to Wilson's absence alone, but the connection was clear given how heavily the Aces have relied on her production in that area throughout the season. The Aces have shown this vulnerability before, even in their Commissioner's Cup championship loss to the New York Liberty, a game Wilson also missed. Las Vegas was outworked on the boards. Sunday's loss in Las Vegas was not an isolated incident so much as a repeat of a pattern the team has dealt with each time its MVP has been unavailable. For Indiana, the win carried its own historical weight. This marked the Fever's first ever victory over the Aces in Las Vegas, a note that stands out regardless of who was or wasn't in uniform for either side. Indiana improved to 12-8 on the season, while the Aces fell to 15-6, still positioned near the top of the standings, but handed a result that will not be forgotten easily given how it unfolded. None of this happened in a vacuum. The broader mood among fans watching the game reflected real frustration, not with the final score, but with the conditions that produced it. A matchup that had been anticipated for weeks as a potential measuring stick game between two of the league's top teams instead played out with both franchise cornerstones in street clothes. For a fan base that had circled this game on the calendar specifically to watch Clark and Wilson compete against each other, the absence of both players drained a significant amount of the intensity and stakes that would normally define a Fever Aces matchup. Comment sections and post-game discussion reflected that disappointment directly, with many viewers describing the game as low energy and lacking the kind of competitive edge associated with these two teams at full strength. Some fans went further, saying they intended to hold off on watching future games until Clark and Wilson were both back on the floor. That reaction is understandable given the stakes both players carry for the league's visibility this season. Clark leads the Fever with 2 assists per game and ranks second on the team in scoring at 21.2 points per game, trailing only Mitchell's 21.6 average. She has been out since aggravating the injury in late June, though she returned to practice this week, and Indiana has been hopeful she could be back for the team's back-to-back set on July 8 and 9. Wilson, meanwhile, remains the reigning 4-time MVP and one of the most productive players in the league when healthy, and Hammond has described her as day-to-day rather than facing a longer-term absence. Both players are expected to be part of the All-Star game later this month in Chicago, which suggests their absences, while disruptive in the short term, are not expected to linger much longer. Still, the frustration expressed by viewers after this particular game speaks to something real about how the product changes without its top-tier talent on the floor. A game decided largely by an offensive rebounding margin and a shooting percentage gap is not going to generate the same highlight reel moments as a game built around two MVP-level scorers going shot for shot. The Fever won by playing disciplined, physical basketball and taking advantage of an opponent missing its most important interior piece. That is a legitimate, well-earned result. It is also, by its nature, a less dramatic style of win than what fans were expecting when this matchup was scheduled. There is also the matter of officiating, which has been a recurring point of frustration among fans this season, including in the aftermath of this game. Discontent with foul calls and their impact on flow and competitiveness has followed several high-profile matchups this year, and this game was no exception in terms of viewer sentiment, even though the final margin was not particularly close. Whether or not specific calls shaped the outcome, the perception among a vocal portion of the fan base has been that officiating inconsistency is undermining competitive integrity across the league, and that sentiment carried into how this game was received regardless of the final scoreline. Taken together, the picture is straightforward. Two elite teams played a game that was decided less by star power than by depth, rebounding, and the accumulation of extra possessions over 40 minutes. Indiana's role players stepped up in the absence of their franchise player. Mitchell and Boston carried the offensive load, and the Fever's discipline on the glass turned a tight first half into a comfortable final margin. Las Vegas, missing the player most responsible for its defensive rebounding all season, could not generate the second chance opportunities that typically define their attack, and their shooting percentage suffered as a result. The final score, an 84-68 Indiana win, reflects a game that widened steadily rather than one decided by a single swing in momentum. Both teams now turn their attention to the return of their missing stars. Indiana hopes to have Clark back for its upcoming back-to-back, while Las Vegas continues to monitor Wilson's recovery with an eye toward the postseason rather than rushing her return. When both are back on the floor, the two teams are scheduled to meet again, and that matchup will carry the full weight of what fans were hoping to see this time. Two MVP-caliber talents, healthy, competing directly against each other, with the surrounding casts built specifically to support that kind of high-stakes basketball. Until then, games like this one will continue to be judged not just on the final score, but on what was missing from the box score entirely. This game did not happen in isolation from a broader injury pattern working its way through the league this season. Beyond Clark and Wilson, Las Vegas guard Kelsey Plum has also been sidelined, and unlike her two co-stars, her timeline back to the court is expected to be longer. Together, the three absences have forced coaching staffs across the league to lean more heavily on role players and secondary scorers earlier in the season than most had planned for. Indiana's performance without Clark is one example of that adjustment working in a team's favor. Mitchell and Boston have effectively become the offensive engine in Clark's absence, and Sunday's result suggests that arrangement is producing wins rather than just holding the line until their all-star guard returns. The standings reflect how much is still at stake even with key players missing time. Indiana improved to 12-8 with the win, keeping pace in a playoff picture that remains competitive across the middle of the conference. Las Vegas, despite the loss, sits at 15-6, still among the top teams in the league, and well-positioned heading into the second half of the season. Neither team's postseason outlook was fundamentally altered by one game in July, but the manner of the loss will likely factor into how Las Vegas approaches Wilson's return. Hammond has already indicated she is thinking about the long term rather than rushing her star back for a mid-season game, and the rebounding numbers from Sunday give her additional data to support that approach. A short-term loss in July carries far less weight than having a healthy, fully effective Wilson available in September. For Indiana, the timeline points toward Clark's potential return during the team's upcoming back-to-back on July 8 and 9. She returned to practice this week, and the Fever have been managing her workload carefully given how the back injury was aggravated during a late June game rather than resulting from a single acute incident. That distinction matters medically. A soft tissue issue that flares up under continued strain requires a different recovery approach than a one-time injury, and it is part of why Indiana has been cautious about setting a firm date for her return rather than targeting a specific game. The league's All-Star break, with the game set for July 25 in Chicago, now functions as an informal deadline for both teams. Clark and Wilson are each scheduled to start, and neither franchise wants to enter that showcase with either player still working back into game shape. That gives both organizations roughly 2.5 weeks to manage the final stretch of recoveries without further setbacks. What Sunday's game ultimately demonstrated is that the absence of a single elite player changes a team's identity more than most in-game adjustments can offset. Las Vegas remains a well-built roster with legitimate depth, but the specific value Wilson provides on the boards is not easily replicated by committee. Indiana, conversely, showed that its supporting cast can carry meaningful stretches of basketball without its most prominent player, a sign of organizational depth that will matter significantly once the roster is back to full strength.